December 12, 1942. Lieutenant Alexei Makarov crouched in the shattered remains of a factory building near the Volga River, 500 meters from the advancing German lines. His squad was down to 6 men. The city of Stalingrad, once a proud industrial hub, had become a graveyard of twisted metal and smoldering ruins. The Germans had been certain that no one could hold this position. Not with such a small force, not with the full weight of the Wehrmacht pressing forward. Makarov's orders were simple: hold the line at all costs. But doubt loomed in the air. His men were outnumbered, supplies were low, and in the distance the relentless roar of German artillery was growing louder, closer. The battle for Stalingrad had entered a new phase, and Makarov's test was just beginning. Alexei Makarov, a 28-year-old lieutenant in the Soviet 62nd Army, had long been a figure of quiet competence in the chaos of Stalingrad. His role was not glamorous. He wasn't part of the elite shock troops, storming German lines, nor was he a famed commander celebrated in the annals of history. Instead, he commanded a small unit of riflemen, tasked with holding a critical, though often overlooked stretch of ground, a task deemed inconsequential by his superiors. Stalingrad, 1942, was a city on fire, quite literally. The Germans had encircled it, and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Inside the city, men were often reduced to nothing more than shadows in the rubble, their movements dictated by instinct and necessity. But Makarov wasn't the kind to be swallowed by the surrounding chaos. He observed. He calculated. He waited for the right moment to strike. It was a role that seemed beneath him. For months, Makarov had been relegated to managing supply lines, patching up defenses, and coordinating minor skirmishes, tasks that were far removed from the critical front lines of the battle. His rise to lieutenant had come not through connections or privilege, but through sheer capability. A cheetah fact few of his peers cared to acknowledge. His background was simple, even unremarkable. Born in a small village in the outskirts of the Volga region, Makarov was the son of a factory worker. He had no prestigious military academy pedigree, no distinguished family name. His military education had been unorthodox. While others were sent to the rigid institutions of the Soviet officer corps, Makarov had spent his early years in practical training, spending days on the firing range, learning firsthand the tactics of irregular warfare, and mastering the art of survival in urban environments. His superiors often dismissed him as the man for the small jobs, and so his unit, though capable, was seen as expendable. In the midst of this environment, Makarov's unconventional background became the source of subtle mockery from the officers around him. "He's more suited to scavenging than commanding," some would joke behind his back. Others made light of his lack of high ranking, endorsements, whispering that he had been promoted merely because of the sheer brutality of the war. Yet, despite the sneers and dismissive gestures, Makarov remained steady. His eyes never wavered from the task at hand. His mind, sharp and clear, was focused on the city around him, on how to hold this ground, and perhaps more importantly, how to make every inch of it cost the Germans dearly. But in the midst of this isolation, there was one thing that set Makarov apart. His credentials, though unspoken, were perhaps the most critical. He had been one of the first officers to understand the importance of Stalingrad as a strategic hub, the crossroads where the Germans would either break their advance toward the oil-rich Caucasus or be crushed under the weight of Soviet resistance. He had, in the most understated manner, recognized the significance of his position, and this understanding, this foresight, had not been overlooked by those higher up the chain. Makarov's grasp on tactics had already proved effective during earlier engagements, and some had quietly taken note of his growing influence in the city's defense, though none would openly admit it. For now, though, Makarov's responsibilities remained modest, his name largely ignored by the outside world. His small squad, his supply missions, his strategic outposts in the ruins, they were seen as small cogs in the massive machine of the Soviet war effort. But in the trenches of Stalingrad, There were no small parts. Each soldier mattered, and each officer's judgment was tested every day. By the time December rolled around, Makarov had seen the full scale of the enemy's operation. The Germans had invested heavily in their assault, and now they were pushing relentlessly towards the heart of the city. It was here, at this critical juncture, that the operation to hold the line took on a new weight. The Wehrmacht's advance was swift, and the Soviets, particularly those in the city's industrial sector, were suffering heavy losses. There were whispers, rising tensions among the men, that the Germans were unbeatable, their machines of war too strong for any single defense. Makarov, however, didn't flinch. He spent long hours poring over maps, studying the patterns of enemy movements, and testing new strategies. He listened to the sound of artillery in the distance, the pounding of boots on the crumbling streets. He could hear the German chatter over the radio, a sign of their increasing confidence. They were about to hit another stronghold. They would push forward. And yet, Makarov wasn't so sure that his men were as outmatched as everyone believed. He had one advantage: the ability to read the situation with a clarity that others lacked. He saw weakness in the German strategy, a hesitation in their advance, one that would soon provide him with an opportunity. The question, though, was simple. Could Makarov hold the line? Could he make the most of this unexpected window, this small but potentially pivotal space in the war? His squad, numbering only 6 men, would have to face wave after wave of German troops, trained, confident, and relentless. But Makarov saw this as his chance to make an impact, however small. It was the opportunity that had been hidden from the eyes of others, and now it was before him. It was not a question of if he could hold the line, but whether he could turn this moment of risk into a significant victory. As Makarov tightened his grip on his rifle, his gaze fixed on the enemy positions in the distance, one thought lingered in the back of his mind. This was his test. It was a risk, a massive one. But in this brutal city, risk was often the only path to survival. And Makarov had learned long ago that survival was never just about holding on. By mid-December 1942, the Germans had intensified their assault on the Soviet positions around the Volga. Their goal was clear: break the Soviet defense, and the gateway to the oil-rich Caucasus would be theirs. What had once been a slow, grinding war of attrition had now turned into a brutal contest of survival. For Makarov and his small squad, the enemy's presence had become undeniable. Each day, the Germans pushed closer, and the Soviet positions, already thin and spread too far, began to crumble under the weight of the offensive. It was a problem that no one seemed capable of solving. The first sign of trouble came when Makarov's position was targeted by a concentrated artillery barrage. The Germans had zeroed in on the factory district, where Makarov's squad was holding a section of the line. The explosions rocked the air, sending debris and dust plummeting through the shattered windows. His men, already weary from weeks of fighting, now found themselves pinned down, unable to return fire with any meaningful effect. The bombardment lasted for hours, and when it finally stopped, only half of his squad remained intact. 3 men had been injured, 1 critically. The line had held, but only just. Makarov watched the men struggle to recover from the attack. He had seen casualties before. He had seen death come for men with more experience and far better training. But this felt different. The losses were no longer just a result of combat. They were the inevitable outcome of a failing strategy. His men were becoming casualties of a war that had escalated beyond their control. The Germans weren't pushing just with tanks and infantry. They were using precision and calculated force. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies above Stalingrad, and the city's ruins had become a labyrinth of death, where any exposed position could be targeted. This wasn't a battle for land anymore. It was a battle for survival. The Germans weren't just attacking. They were forcing the Soviets into a siege, one in which every defensive line was a death sentence, unless the right solution could be found. The conventional solutions had already been exhausted. For days, Makarov had followed orders to hold his position, using standard Soviet tactics, holding firm, retreating when necessary, and waiting for reinforcements. But there were no reinforcements coming. Supplies had been cut off. The German advance was too swift for any hope of significant reinforcements to reach the front. What had been expected to be a defensive engagement was slowly turning into a one-sided massacre. The German forces, far superior in number and firepower, were too well prepared. Standard approaches, conventional Soviet tactics honed in other theaters of the war, had faltered here. The city was too ruined, too fragmented. The terrain worked against the defenders, forcing them into static positions where movement was limited and every action was calculated. The German strategy was designed to exploit these very weaknesses. Their infantry moved in disciplined formations, while their artillery and airstrikes systematically dismantled Soviet lines. But it wasn't just the Germans' brute force that had made Makarov's position untenable. The pressure from above was mounting as well. His commanding officer had sent repeated messages urging him to hold the line, to push back the Germans, to keep fighting. Yet there was no question of victory in sight. The higher-ups seemed oblivious to the situation on the ground. The orders were always the same: hold at all costs. But holding wasn't enough anymore. The Soviets had already started retreating from other parts of the city. Their forces stretched thin, and Makarov was becoming increasingly isolated. As the days dragged on, the calls for reinforcements grew more desperate. His unit was now reduced to only 5 men. His own squad had taken the worst of the casualties. The others were scattered across the city, fighting their own battles in other sectors. Makarov's position was now a symbol of stubborn resistance, but it was starting to feel like the last vestige of a failed strategy. In the face of overwhelming enemy strength, the standard Soviet tactics seemed almost laughable. Reinforcement couldn't come. Their entrenched positions were vulnerable to German air superiority. Standard-issue Soviet weapons, designed for different kinds of engagements, were proving ineffective against the highly coordinated German forces. The Soviet infantry rifles were accurate, but the Germans had machine guns, tanks, and artillery that could pulverize Makarov's men from a distance. The smaller, hand-to-hand engagements the Soviets excelled at were now impossible in a battlefield this fragmented, with no support and no room to maneuver. Makarov knew that conventional solutions wouldn't work here. His strategy had to be different. He had to find a way to use the urban terrain to his advantage, to turn the factory ruins into a deadly maze for the Germans, one that their superior numbers couldn't easily exploit. But there was no time left to overthink. His men were running low on ammunition. Their positions were no longer secure, and the pressure from the enemy was relentless. The urgency was undeniable now. Every passing hour saw more artillery shells falling, more German patrols pushing through the crumbling streets, and less hope that any Soviet reinforcements would arrive in time. The factory district was now in the grip of a storm. The thunderous pounding of the German advance was deafening. Makarov couldn't afford to waste time waiting for help that might never come. The Germans were closing in, and he could feel the weight of the impending attack bearing down on him. If he didn't act now, his squad would be gone, perhaps even the entire Soviet line in this area. The reality of the situation pressed in, and with it, the understanding that this was the moment for bold action. Makarov had been trained for moments like this, but no amount of preparation could account for the scale of the decision before him. His task was no longer about holding the line. It was about finding a way to disrupt the enemy's advance, to make them question their certainty that victory was assured. But how? The solution wasn't immediately clear. The terrain was too open, the numbers too stacked against him. The Germans had adapted to every standard Soviet tactic. They were evolving, learning, adjusting. And now Makarov was left with nothing but his wits, his knowledge of the battlefield, and the grim determination of a leader who knew that if his squad fell here, the entire defense of Stalingrad could collapse. Makarov had to act. And as the German forces moved closer, He would need to decide quickly. The morning of December 14th, 1942, dawned cold and unforgiving. The weather had turned harsher, the early signs of winter cutting through the city with bitter winds and heavy snow. The ruins of Stalingrad, once the thriving heart of Soviet industry, now felt like a maze of skeletal structures, their jagged edges piercing the gray sky. Makarov's position, situated in the remains of a once bustling factory, was barely defensible. The terrain was broken and uneven, the remains of walls and scattered debris making movement slow and hazardous. Visibility was poor. The snow fell in thick sheets, obscuring everything beyond a few meters. This was no battlefield of open ground, but a claustrophobic nightmare. Narrow alleys, shattered windows, crumbling stone walls, and the ever-present sound of distant gunfire. The Germans had turned much of the city into a killing zone, their forces taking advantage of every advantage Stalingrad's ruined streets offered. Makarov's orders were simple: deploy his squad to hold a small section of the eastern edge of the factory, just enough to prevent the German forces from making their way toward the Volga. It was an isolated sector, and Makarov knew he would be alone for much of the day. His men, though capable, were too few to cover all the areas needed. One section of the line would be his responsibility and his alone. The usual approach to such a task would involve fortified positions with overlapping fields of fire, supported by constant communication with other units. But the situation here was different. Makarov had no communications, no reinforcements would come. He had no choice but to rely on the terrain, on his own instincts, and on the lessons he had learned from months of observing the enemy's movements. The factory lay ahead, its towering skeleton still imposing despite the damage it had endured. The broken windows, shattered by months of shelling, presented only narrow gaps through which to see. The enemy had already made tentative pushes from the south, but their forces had faltered in the face of the Soviet resistance. For now, they were regrouping, preparing for a fresh offensive. Makarov moved with quiet precision. He had decided that the best way to disrupt the German advance was not through sheer firepower, but by creating confusion, forcing them to question the strength of the Soviet position. To do that, he would have to act as if his squad had greater numbers, as if they were everywhere at once. The first step was simple: identify the enemy's approach. From his position atop a crumbled wall, Makarov watched the German patrols move across an open space to the south, their figures appearing briefly through the falling snow. They moved methodically, covering one another, but there was a predictable pattern. They would advance, halt to survey the area, then push forward again. The lack of cover in the open ground made them vulnerable, especially if they were unaware of any resistance. Makarov made his move. He positioned himself at a narrow gap in the crumbling wall, giving him a clear line of sight to the German patrol. His rifle, well maintained despite the harsh conditions, sat comfortably in his hands. He checked his breathing. The cold air burned his lungs, but he pushed it aside. He had trained for moments like this. No hesitation, no wasted movements. The German patrol moved closer. Makarov waited for the right moment. One man in the group, a corporal by the look of his insignia, strayed slightly from the others, edging toward the open ground. It was a small mistake, but in war, small mistakes could be fatal. The corporal's foot caught on a piece of debris, and for a split second he was off balance. Makarov took the shot. The report of his rifle was muffled by the snow, but the outcome was immediate. The corporal dropped without a sound, his comrades unaware of the source of the shot. Makarov had taken him out with one clean, well-placed shot, his target now lying motionless in the snow. The patrol halted, unsure of what had just happened, scanning the area. But they had no idea where the fire had come from. Makarov had already moved, his position no longer revealed, his figure concealed by the rubble of the factory walls. The Germans hesitated. They began moving, cautiously, fanning out in search of the sniper. Makarov knew that the success of this moment relied on keeping them off balance. As the patrol spread out, Makarov repositioned to a better vantage point, a higher wall, one that gave him a broader view of the open area ahead. For the next several minutes, Makarov tracked their movements. He could see the confusion in their ranks. Their usual sense of certainty was replaced by a growing unease. Each time a soldier moved into a potential line of fire, Makarov held back. Patience was his ally now. He didn't need to kill every soldier, he just needed to disrupt their confidence. And then, another mistake. One of the soldiers, a younger man with a rifle slung across his back, appeared in the open, moving toward the body of the fallen corporal. His intent was clear, to confirm the kill and clear the area. But the moment he stepped into view, Makarov took another shot. The man fell, again without warning. Now, the German patrol was on edge. Their communications were disjointed, their movements slower, more deliberate. Makarov's isolated position had become a force of disruption. The Germans were no longer advancing, they were retreating, falling back toward the cover of the surrounding ruins. The first phase of his plan had worked. The patrol had been driven off, their advance stopped before it could gain momentum. It was a small victory, one that would be hard for anyone outside Makarov's small unit to notice. But it was enough. He had achieved the initial objective: delay the Germans, keep them guessing, and make them pay for every inch of progress. Makarov did not linger to admire his success. He knew that the Germans would return with greater force. His success was not a permanent victory, but merely a momentary disruption in the larger machine of the German war effort. There would be more attacks, more patrols, and the pressure would only increase. But for now he had proven one thing: even in this isolated sector, even with so few men, it was possible to turn the tide. And with that, Makarov withdrew, leaving behind a trail of disruption and doubt. It wasn't long before Makarov's success was met with a shift in the German approach. The first few days after the disruption had passed quickly, but the impact of the small victories he had achieved lingered in the air. The Germans, skilled and disciplined, were not the type to let mistakes go uncorrected. The moment they felt the sting of Makarov's precision, they began to adapt. By December 16, 1942, Makarov could sense the change in the air. The Germans had learned from their earlier missteps. They no longer advanced without caution. They no longer separated into vulnerable patrols. Instead, they came prepared, adapted, calculating their movements with greater care. And now, the threat to Makarov's small squad was growing, becoming less about skill and more about the choices he had to make in real time. The Germans had countered Makarov's rifle fire with suppressive artillery fire. Now, each time Makarov repositioned, he could hear the sound of shells whistling through the air, closer than before. The bombs fell with a purpose, smashing against the rubble, shaking the very ground beneath his feet. They knew he was there. They were making sure he wouldn't have the freedom to move unnoticed again. Makarov's squad, already reduced and strained, had no choice but to huddle in smaller pockets of resistance. Every time they moved, the enemy was waiting. It was no longer just about outmaneuvering them. It was about surviving their counterattacks. The Germans weren't charging blindly anymore. They had adjusted their strategy, increasing the firepower and frequency of their bombardments, bringing in additional infantry and armor support. They were no longer simply walking into a Soviet trap. They had learned the value of patience and precision. From his position atop the crumbling remnants of a factory wall, Makarov watched as the Germans deployed new tactics. They no longer made rash advances but instead stayed in cover, using the snowstorm to their advantage, moving in tighter formations. The weather, which had once been an ally for the defenders, now only gave the enemy more opportunities to close the gap. Visibility was still low, but the snow worked against Makarov as much as it did for the enemy. It was no longer possible to track every movement. But Makarov had already planned for this eventuality. His first successful shot had forced the Germans into caution, but it was now becoming apparent that the margin for error had grown narrower. The battle had shifted. He wasn't just fighting to disrupt anymore, he was fighting to survive. And the decision-making that had worked in the initial moments of the conflict was no longer enough. The German response was methodical. They began to drop smoke shells to obscure his view, hiding their movements. Makarov couldn't track them with his rifle anymore. He had no choice but to fall back and take shelter deeper within the factory ruins. It wasn't just the artillery or the smoke. It was the relentless nature of the counterattacks that made the situation dire. Every time Makarov thought he had bought a moment of respite, another barrage would explode nearby, knocking the air from his lungs and sending his men scrambling for cover. The enemy had shifted their focus to forcing Makarov out. They stopped taking open risks. Instead, they waited for him to make a mistake, to give them a window of opportunity. It was clear now that their tactics had changed. They had learned. They were moving in tighter, more secure formations, using suppressive fire to cover any potential flanks. And with every passing hour, Makarov's options were closing in. The factory, once an ideal location to hold the line, was now becoming a trap. Makarov had counted on its broken walls and maze-like passages for cover, but the Germans were adapting, using the very rubble to their advantage. They had sent small groups into the surrounding buildings, creating choke points that Makarov could no longer avoid. The decision-making now wasn't about how to kill the enemy. It was about how to avoid being overwhelmed. Each decision now carried the weight of survival. Should he reposition to a more defensible area? Should he attempt to make another stand, to disrupt the German advance again? But with each decision, the margin for error narrowed. His men were exhausted. Ammunition was running low. The factory walls that once offered protection now felt like a cage. There was nowhere left to retreat without exposing the squad to the full brunt of the German assault. The time for isolated engagements had passed. The Germans were pushing, adapting, and their advantage was only growing. Then it came. A sudden shift in the enemy's approach. Tanks. Makarov had expected it. The Germans, sensing the weakened position of the Soviet line, had deployed armor into the fray. The heavy rumble of tank engines reached Makarov's ears, just as the first of them appeared, moving in from the south. The factory walls, once a useful defense, were no match for the rolling behemoths of steel. Makarov surveyed the situation. His first instinct was to fall back further into the ruins, to give up the position entirely. But retreat was risky. With the Germans deploying armored support, pulling back would expose his men to fire from multiple directions. Staying meant a higher likelihood of being trapped. The factory had become a death trap. Makarov's eyes scanned the terrain. There was no immediate cover, no clear escape route, and with every passing minute, the risk of being surrounded increased. The decision to stand his ground was becoming less of a choice and more of a necessity. He had to engage the German armor. It was no longer about just surviving. It was about giving his men a chance to escape. But the reality was harsh. The German tanks, moving steadily, had the upper hand. The risk now was no longer theoretical. It was a guarantee. Makarov didn't have the tools to confront tanks head-on. His squad had no anti-tank weapons, and the urban landscape offered few chances for the kind of ambush that had worked earlier. It would take something more, something unexpected, to make it work. Makarov's mind raced. The Germans had adapted, but he hadn't yet run out of options. But the question was, could he act quickly enough before the decision was taken out of his hands entirely? By the morning of December 17, 1942, Makarov had become both the hunter and the hunted. The Germans, adapting to his earlier successes, had transitioned from careful advancement to an all-out push, using their superior firepower to force Makarov's small squad into ever-narrowing corners. Their tanks, now rumbling through the shattered cityscape, gave the Germans the confidence to push forward with the kind of relentless force that had once been their hallmark. But Makarov wasn't just going to give up the ground. He couldn't. The factory, though no longer the advantageous fortress it had once been, still offered a strategic location. There was no retreat now, To pull back would only buy a few minutes before the German tanks closed in, and the squad would be slaughtered in the open. Staying meant fighting through the storm, making sure that every German who tried to cross this threshold paid the price. The battle had shifted from a test of endurance to one of deception. Makarov had to draw the Germans in, just as they had done to him. The margin for error was smaller now. Each move counted. A single mistake could expose his men to certain death. And so, with a clear head, Makarov began setting his trap. The first step was simple: bait. The Germans, emboldened by the arrival of their tanks, would no longer be as cautious. Makarov knew they would start probing his defenses, testing for weaknesses. To give them a hint of vulnerability was the key. Makarov repositioned his squad, ensuring that the German scouts would see signs of activity where there was none. He left just enough of a gap in the eastern wall to make it seem like a vulnerable point, an area where they could advance unchallenged. It was a risky move, but Makarov knew that the Germans would take the bait. They would be too confident in their armor and firepower to resist. He set up his men in a way that would make them seem like a scattered force, already preparing to retreat. Their positions were slightly less concealed, their movements more visible. If the Germans were watching, they would see only a shell of the resistance that had held this position. The idea was to lure them in, get them to move just a bit closer. But this time, Makarov would not be the one retreating. For the next several hours, Makarov and his squad held their positions, waiting. The snow continued to fall, thickening, with every passing minute, covering their tracks and masking the sounds of their movements. The cold was unbearable, and the silence that filled the ruined factory seemed to stretch on endlessly, broken only by the distant rumblings of German tanks and the occasional staccato bursts of machine gun fire. And then, the first German infantry patrol appeared at the edge of the factory complex. They moved cautiously at first, checking the ground for signs of Soviet presence. The tanks remained behind, circling the area like vultures, waiting for a signal to push forward. The patrol advanced, moving along the narrow alleys between the shattered walls, slowly closing in on the bait Makarov had set. Makarov's hand tightened around his rifle. This was the moment of truth. His men stayed perfectly still. Any movement now would give them away. The patrol moved closer, closer still. Makarov could see the men's figures becoming clearer through the drifting snow. He held his breath. Timing was everything. If he waited too long, the Germans would fall back. If he acted too soon, the risk of failure would be too high. The first soldier stepped into his line of sight, moving cautiously. Then came the second, and then the third. They were in position. Makarov adjusted his aim, watching through the broken window frame, waiting for the perfect shot. He wasn't looking for a kill, he was looking for a distraction. He needed them to feel the pressure, to begin questioning whether the Soviet forces were still in their old positions. With a steady exhale, Makarov fired. A single shot rang out, precise, deadly, and clean. The soldier closest to the wall crumpled, taken down by the sniper's bullet. There was no time for hesitation. Makarov's men immediately opened fire, hitting the remaining soldiers in the patrol. They didn't have time to react. Within seconds, half of the patrol had been neutralized. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The Germans now, aware that they were under attack, scrambled to reorganize, but Makarov had already moved. He wasn't waiting for the tanks to arrive. The snowstorm gave him cover, and he shifted his squad to new positions quickly, remaining as silent as possible. The remaining German soldiers began calling for reinforcements, but it was clear that the initiative had shifted. Makarov had baited them perfectly, but now the German response was coming faster than expected. The infantry was already retreating, but the tanks began their advance with renewed urgency. Makarov could hear the deep rumble of their engines, and with every passing second, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. The timing pressure was immense. If he couldn't finish the job before the tanks arrived, his men would be trapped. Makarov's mind raced. The trap had worked, but the execution was still fragile. The Germans were regrouping quickly, and their tanks were now pushing forward with coordinated fire. The factory was becoming an increasingly dangerous place to fight, but Makarov had one advantage: misdirection. He ordered his men to reposition, moving through the lower levels of the factory to create the illusion of a larger force. They moved in silence, using the factory's ruins to hide their movements. Makarov's strategy had always been based on deception, and now it was paying off. The Germans, thinking they were being attacked by a much larger force, hesitated. They couldn't push forward without risking complete annihilation. But Makarov knew that the tanks would not stop forever. He had to act. The timing was growing critical. If he didn't make the right decision now, his squad would be overwhelmed. His men held their fire as the first tank rolled into the courtyard of the factory, its massive turret swiveling in search of targets. Makarov's eyes narrowed. He had one chance to make this work. A single mistake, a single miscalculation would cost them everything. The Germans had learned their lesson. They were not about to make the same mistake twice. But neither was Makarov. By December 18, 1942, Makarov had come to a single, inescapable conclusion. The Germans were no longer fighting to advance. They were fighting to trap him. The tanks, the coordinated infantry, the artillery, everything about their movements told him that the Germans were about to launch a final, decisive push to crush his squad. They had fallen back momentarily after the earlier ambush, but they had regrouped quickly, and now they were closing in once again, this time with a calculated precision that betrayed their knowledge of the terrain and his movements. But Makarov wasn't rushing to respond. The cold was biting, the air thick with the muffled sounds of distant gunfire, and the clock was ticking. But he understood that he couldn't afford to act out of panic. Patience, restraint. These were the keys to survival. If he acted too quickly, if he rushed into an open fight with their tanks or infantry, he would seal the fate of his men. For hours, Makarov observed. From his position, just below the second floor of the factory ruins, he could see the Germans in their final preparations. Their tanks were lined up in a staggered formation outside the walls, as if waiting for a signal to launch the assault. Infantrymen moved in groups of 3, their faces grim behind their helmets, taking up position behind wreckage and rubble. Makarov knew they were watching him. The Germans were no longer trying to advance through the open spaces of the factory. They had learned to work with the environment. They were laying siege to him, one step at a time. They weren't rushing. They had learned the value of patience, but Makarov had learned it too. And as he watched the German movements, something crucial clicked. The Germans were closing in from multiple angles. They had covered the immediate front with tanks, making it nearly impossible to advance without being caught in their fire. Their infantry, meanwhile, had begun encircling the building, pushing from the rear and the flanks. It was a classic pincer move, the kind Makarov had seen on training manuals, but the mistake, he realized, lay in how they were executing it. The Germans had overlooked one key detail. Their own tanks were blocking their own path. The front line, where Makarov had first seen the tanks push forward, was completely sealed off by the armored vehicles. The Germans had positioned their tanks too far forward, too close to the factory. The infantry, moving cautiously around the building, was trying to form a perimeter. But in doing so, they were restricting their own advance. The tanks were too close to the factory, unable to reposition without exposing themselves to Makarov's fire. It was a trap they had set for themselves, and Makarov knew it. But they wouldn't see it. They had no reason to suspect that their own strategy was flawed. They had come with the intent to crush his resistance with overwhelming force, but they hadn't accounted for a force like his, small, precise, and intelligent. The problem now was simple. How could he exploit the Germans' mistake without rushing into a head-on confrontation that could cost his men their lives? The tanks were close, their firepower immense. If he engaged them too soon, his position would be exposed, and the Germans would be able to concentrate their fire on him from every angle. But if he waited long enough, he could use their own plans against them. Makarov considered the terrain. His squad had been positioned in a way that made them seem scattered, but he hadn't fully deployed them yet. There was one more step to take before the trap would be complete. The Germans had made a fundamental miscalculation. In their eagerness to box him in, they had left certain gaps in their perimeter. There were small, narrow alleyways, spaces that the tanks couldn't cover, but where his men could hide. They had the perfect vantage points, but only if they could hold out just a little longer. Patience, restraint. Makarov refused to move until he was certain. The Germans were still trying to close the circle, pushing their infantry forward to check for any remaining resistance. He watched as they made their way along the northern edge of the factory, unaware of the deadly trap now closing in on them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence and careful observation, Makarov made his decision. His men, positioned in the gaps in the factory, had the perfect sight lines on the Germans moving along the northern edge. The tanks were still too far from the building to make a direct impact, and the infantry had begun to spread too thin, as if they were convinced they had eliminated the threat. Makarov knew that the moment the first German infantryman moved into the open, into the kill zone, he would need to strike quickly. He signaled his squad to hold steady, their rifles trained on the enemy. The Germans, just as Makarov had anticipated, began pushing forward. The first soldier stepped into the open, his rifle raised, ready for a final push. He was followed by another, then another. Makarov's squad remained still, watching as the trap began to take shape. At the right moment, Makarov gave the order. In an instant, his men opened fire. Precision shots rang out from the factory's ruins, hitting their marks with deadly accuracy. The first German infantryman dropped without a sound, followed quickly by the second and third. The remaining soldiers hesitated, turning to retreat, but it was already too late. They had been caught in the narrow gap between the tanks and the factory walls, exposed and vulnerable. Makarov's squad, now in full motion, began to push from their hidden positions, closing in on the Germans. They moved quickly, with surgical precision, targeting the remaining infantry. But Makarov wasn't done. He needed to draw the tanks into the open, where they would be vulnerable. The final part of his plan was simple. The Germans had been using their tanks to cover the infantry, but they had underestimated one critical detail. They had positioned themselves too close. Makarov's squad continued to push the German infantry back, making sure to leave just enough space for the tanks to believe they were safe. And then, when the first tank moved into position, Makarov's men, positioned at the edge of the factory, took their shot. The first tank exploded in a ball of fire, its crew caught off guard by the sudden strike. The remaining German armor attempted to retreat, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The Germans had thought they could trap Makarov, but it was they who had been ensnared in their own plan. The final days of December 1942 brought with them the full weight of what Makarov had fought for. The German forces, now fully aware of the resistance they faced, had pushed harder. The line they had taken, the strategy they had executed with such confidence, was now at risk of crumbling beneath Makarov's intelligence and restraint. But there was no more room for calculated moves. The final test was now upon him, and it was the most dangerous one yet. The Germans, with their shattered armor and depleted infantry, had one last card to play. An all-out assault that would leave no room for maneuver, no time for reconsideration. They sent everything they had left, tanks, infantry, and every piece of artillery within range. There would be no retreat, no mercy. Makarov's squad, still holding their ground, was now down to just 3 men, his own rifle, one soldier with a machine gun, and another with a light mortar. The ammunition was running out. The tanks were coming again, but this time they were covered by an overwhelming barrage of firepower. The advantage was no longer his. The factory ruins that had served as his fortress now felt like a trap, a place of walls too broken to protect him and too small to maneuver through. The orders that had come down from his superiors, far removed from the battlefield, had never been more irrelevant. Reinforcements were a distant dream. His squad was on their own, isolated from the rest of the Soviet effort. There was no plan B, no contingency. It was just Makarov's judgment and his men's resolve. The first wave of German infantry reached the outer perimeter of the factory within minutes. They moved cautiously, well aware of the traps they'd been shown. Makarov's rifle never wavered, but each shot was more difficult than the last. His squad's fire was slowing, their resources nearly spent. His machine gunner, once steady, now fumbled with the weapon as exhaustion crept in. Makarov's mind raced. Each decision, each shot had to be perfect. He gave the order. The remaining mortar round was fired. It landed just short of the tanks, the explosion a weak deterrent at best. The tanks rumbled closer. The Germans had adapted. They had learned not to rush in. They were moving in a tighter formation now, careful not to expose themselves too early. For Makarov, this was the moment that would define everything. There was no second chance, no fallback position to consider. It was a test of the highest order: fight back and hold the line, or risk being overrun. His rifle cracked again, but this time there was no satisfaction in the shot. The tank continued its advance. The snow was falling harder now, blanketing the ruins, turning the battlefield into an almost surreal wasteland of white and gray. The tanks came closer. One tank stopped at the factory entrance, its turret slowly turning toward Makarov's position. His eyes locked on the machine as it turned, focusing all his attention. One shot. One perfect shot. He moved. The tank fired first, too early. The blast sent a shockwave through the ground, but Makarov wasn't there anymore. The moment the tank turned its turret, he was already repositioning. His rifle was steady. His aim was true. The shot hit. The tank faltered, its turret jerking violently. Makarov's men had already started moving, leaving behind the factory and disappearing into the smoldering ruins. His action had given them the window they needed to escape. But no one would know this. No one would see the sacrifice, the cold calculation, or the precise nature of the decision that had kept them alive. For Makarov, this was just another day in the war, a job to be done, a task to be completed. The Germans would report it differently. They would describe the unexpected defeat, the failure of their assault. But Makarov would not hear those reports. They would go to a desk somewhere far from the battlefield. No fanfare, no recognition. He had done his job. The line had been held. But even as the snow settled, even as the sound of the German retreat filled the air, the question lingered. Could anyone else have made that decision in time?